Good Sabbath, everyone.
Good Sabbath.
Good to be back with you again. Please turn in your Bibles to our passage from last week, Matthew 22:34 through 40. Matthew 22:34 through 40. We're going to continue in our series on the greatest and second greatest commandments. So if you have your Bibles, or if you want, you can read along on the screen. But when the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they gathered themselves together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Now we've gone through loving the Lord your God, the first and greatest commandment. We talked about loving God with your heart, loving God with your soul, with your mind, and with your strength. And we've also talked about the fact that Jesus put a qualifier on there that on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. So the focus of today's message is the second greatest commandment, which Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. So the title of today's message is, what did Jesus mean by as yourself? Now first I would like to emphasize that this is a commandment, not an option. This is not of if it feels good or if you feel like it. This is not even a if you want to be known as one of mine. This is what you will do. This is the second most important command from God, so to me it would seem like it deserves quite a bit of our attention. It is our mission, our directive, if you will. In fact, I would submit to you that these two commandments are the core purpose of our existence. To love God with all our being and to love our neighbor with ourselves, as ourself. And yet, according to John Piper, it's also a very radical command. Piper says, "What I mean by radical is this: it cuts to the root of our sinfulness and exposes it, and by God's grace severs it. The root of our sinfulness is the desire for our own happiness apart from God and apart from the happiness of others in God." That's a lot to comprehend, so I'm going to say that again. The root of our sinfulness is the desire for our own happiness apart from God and apart from the happiness of others in God. All sin comes from a desire to be happy that is cut off from the glory of God and cut off from the good of others. And the command of Jesus here cuts to this root, exposes it, and severs it. I don't know about you, but I could chew on that a while and just go home. But wait, there's more. One of my sons and I were talking recently about some behavior that was going on, and I said, "What do you think motivates us to do these selfish things that we do?" And between our two of us discussing, we concluded that ultimately pride is the root of that behavior. It's a root we need to pull out. Pride is the root of sinfulness. Some claim that it is the greatest sin. If you go back even to the fall of Satan, that's what motivated him, was his pride and his abilities in himself. So much so that he deceived himself into thinking he could be greater or at least equal to his Creator. Pride. You see, our innate, that is, it's born in us. We don't choose it. It's part of our DNA, if you will. Our innate pride deceives us into believing that we can somehow be happy without including God in the equation. Many of you know that I'm a big fan of a 53 GMC 5-window truck with 3 on the tree. I think they're neat. It's what I learned to drive on. But what would motivate me many times into getting that or any other thing is because somehow, even subconsciously, I think that if I just have this thing or that thing, I'll be happy. And this is what Jesus is exposing here in both of these commandments. Especially when he adds to loving our neighbor as ourself. He's opening up our hearts and showing the core of our being something that needs to change. You see, our innate pride deceives us into believing not only that we can be happy without depending on God as the source of our happiness, but our pride also deceives us and puts us in a position where we don't care if others find their happiness in God. Because it's not about them, it's all about me. You see, pride is our drive, our thirst, if you will, to be happy or content that has been distorted by two things. One is our unwillingness to see God as the only source of genuine and permanent happiness and contentment. Tell me that you don't struggle as I do to find that I'm seeking for things to make me happy or feel safe or otherwise that have nothing to do with God. Whether it's my 401k or finishing medical school, whatever the case may be, we somehow deceive ourselves into thinking that if my kids would just do this, if this marriage was resolved, that somehow that would bring the happiness that we so long for. Because that's what our pride wants, is that our needs are met. Our unwillingness to see God as the only source of genuine and permanent happiness. And the other is our unwillingness to view other people as people who have been created by God to obtain complete and permanent contentment in Him. When's the last time you looked at someone else that way? As someone who has been created by God to obtain complete and permanent contentment in Him. Some people call it the God-shaped hole in your heart. I think it's something that's missing not just in our heart but in our entire being. That contentment that we can only find in God. You see, folks, when you remove God from your solution to be as the solution to your desire to be happy and content, so you set God aside. And when you remove people as those designed to be recipients of your happiness, because that's what we're supposed to do with our happiness in God, is share it with others, then the only thing left is pride to drive you to find temporary happiness. False happiness, that is. Pastor Piper says, pride is the pursuit of happiness anywhere but in the glory of God and the good of other people. This is the root of all sin. Pride is the pursuit of happiness anywhere but in the glory of God and the good of other people. This is the root of all sin. There'll be more on this in another message. But in our passage today, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And by doing that, as I stated earlier, he points out and lays bare the root of our sinfulness. Jesus is saying, let's start with your inherited, most defining human trait. That is, your love for yourself. And notice Jesus states this as a given. There's no exceptions. There's not people that say, oh, I hate myself, so I can't fulfill this command. Jesus states this as a given. Love people as you love yourself. Jesus shines a light on their soul and states all of you have a powerful instinct of self-preservation and self-fulfillment. All of you want to be happy, and all of you want to live. Self-preservation. You want food for yourself. You want clothes for yourself. You want a place to live for yourself. You want protection from violence against yourself. And all of you want to live your lives with satisfaction and contentment. Am I right? You want meaningful and pleasant activity to fill your days. You want some friends to like you and spend some time with you. You want your life to have meaning and purpose. And Jesus is saying here, all of that is self-love. Jesus says all of this is self-love. That deep longing to diminish or eliminate pain and to increase or perpetuate happiness. This is what Jesus means when he says, as yourself. Do you begin to get that picture? You see, all of mankind is born with this trait. Everyone is. All the way back to the garden. And it is this self-love that motivates all of our actions. Even suicide is sought after from a motivation of self-love. Suicide is nothing more than an attempt to escape the intolerable. And believe me, I know from personal experience. When we are in the depths of despair, when life seems meaningless and hopeless, when the pain we are suffering due to our current situation, whether it's real or imagined, in the throes of our depression, we tell ourselves, I have no hope. My pain is intolerable. I can't endure this any longer. And while I'm uncertain what death will bring, at least I will escape my current situation. Self-love. Did you notice all the I statements that I just quoted? I have no hope. My pain is intolerable. I can't endure this any longer. I will escape my current situation. We are not loving God with our everything. And at that moment, we are loving ourselves with our everything. Through our deep longing to diminish or eliminate pain. We are loving ourselves more than God. So yes, even suicide is an act of self-love. I realize as much as anyone that mental illness is real, but it is exacerbated and at times driven by our own pride, our self-love. So we go back to the passage. Jesus is saying, let's begin with self-love. I know this about you. All people suffer from this. You don't learn it growing up. It is in the very DNA, the fabric of your being. Our Father in heaven created you this way. And here's a news flash. In and of itself, it is good. You say, well, wait a minute, Pastor. You just said that it was sin. No, I said pride is the root of our sinfulness. When pride gets involved in our self-love, you'll see what happens. You see, it's not evil to hunger for food, or to want to be warm in the winter, or be safe in a crisis. It's not evil to want to be healthy during a plague, or be liked by others, or even want your life to count in some significant way. Because God created man this way in the beginning. And in and of itself, it is not evil. The sin, the evilness is revealed when you listen to and respond to Jesus' commandment here. As you love yourself, so love your neighbor. The life application is this. In the same way that you crave food when you're hungry, crave food for those around you when they are hungry. You know how to seek, to find and wear clothes that make you feel good and comfortable and warm. Jesus is saying here we are to seek clothes with that same passion for our neighbor to feel good and comfortable and warm. You like to have a roof over your head that is warm and comfortable, right? Then as much as you strive to achieve this, Strive in the same way and with the same passion to ensure your neighbor has a roof over their head that is warm and comfortable. Don't just make sure they have a place to be, but seek that they have a place like yours with the same passion you seek yours with. We all want to feel safe and secure in our daily lives, right? Well, Jesus says we're to strive for this for our neighbors with the same intensity that we do for ourselves. We move into good neighborhoods because we want a place that's safe for our kids. Jesus is saying, go and make sure there are neighborhoods that are safe for everyone with the same passion that you do. All of us want to be liked and have friends, right? Jesus is saying, seek to ensure your neighbor is liked and has friends the same way you seek to have friends and be liked. In fact, I would say that he goes a step further and says, be his or her friend in the same way you would want someone else to do for you. That's what he was referring to in Matthew 7:12 when he said, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. You see, the sin of self-love is revealed when we ignore or even outright refuse to love our neighbors with the same intensity, focus, and purpose with which we love ourselves. Jesus is saying we are to measure our love for others by our love for ourselves. A radical concept, to be sure. And I don't know about you, but for me, it's one that's difficult to grasp in its entirety because we are simply not wired that way, right? We are wired to think about ourselves first. John Piper explains it this way. He says, make your self-seeking the measure of your self-giving. Make your self-seeking the measure of your self-giving. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, the word as is very radical. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's a big word, 2 letters, as. And it means if you are energetic in the pursuit of your own happiness, be energetic in pursuing the happiness of your neighbor. If you're creative in pursuing your own happiness, be creative in pursuing the happiness of your neighbor. If you are persevering in the pursuit of your own happiness, be persevering in pursuing the happiness of your neighbor. In other words, Jesus is not just saying seek for your neighbor the same thing you seek for yourself, but also seek it for them in the same way. The same zeal and energy and creativity and perseverance, the same life and death commitment when you are in danger. Make your own self-seeking the measure of your self-giving. Measure your pursuit of happiness of others and what it should be by the pursuit of your own happiness. How do you pursue your well-being? Pursue your neighbor's well-being that way too. So why is this concept so hard to embrace? Well, for one thing, it seems to threaten our own well-being, right? We feel that if we do this to the extent with which Jesus is commanding here, it somehow will mean we can no longer love ourselves. I'm so busy doing for them and making sure they are taken care of, I'm neglecting myself. As if somehow making others happy will threaten our own happiness. As if meeting others' needs will somehow result in our own needs being neglected or forsaken. And in fact, I would submit to you that it moves us to fear that in our devotion to obeying this command, our own needs and desires will no longer be addressed at all. And we recoil from that. We feel that this focus on our neighbor's well-being and happiness will somehow diminish or eliminate our own self-love. And by the way, our pride doesn't like this. And there's where the sin comes in. It is then that we reason that if the desire for happiness and preservation of ourselves is not in and of itself evil, then how can we ignore it to focus on the well-being of others? Won't the attention to and the energy spent in loving others as myself result in no longer taking care of myself? Piper posits that it is a threat to our own well-being that Jesus intended for us to feel when he issued that command. And this is the very reason that the first and most important commandment was given first. He says it is the first commandment that makes the second commandment doable and takes away the threat that the second commandment is really the suicide of our own happiness. Did you make that connection? The first commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. You see, here's the key. The first commandment is the basis of the second commandment. The second commandment is a visible expression of the first commandment. Which means this: before you make your own self-seeking the measure of your self-giving, make God the focus of your self-seeking. And that's the whole point of the first commandment. In other words, if our focus is first on loving God with all of our being, then we will find our desire and drive for satisfaction is satisfied. Let me say that again. If our focus is first on loving God with all of our being, then we will find our desire and drive for satisfaction is satisfied. Our hearts and minds will be filled because we have found a satisfaction that fills our hearts. We've found a relationship with Him that fills the longing of our souls. We've found the wisdom and knowledge that illuminates and empowers our minds like no other education or experience. Our self-love won't be diminished because it will be satisfied. You see, our self-love should first be so focused on God that all of our passion to be content, to be satisfied, to have our lives have meaning and purpose, to ensure our needs are met, is addressed and fulfilled in loving God with all of our being. Can you say amen? Our self-love should be first so focused on God that all of our passion to be content and satisfied, to have our lives have meaning and purpose, to ensure our needs are met, is addressed and fulfilled in loving God with all of our being. Jesus gave you the answer as to how to do the second commandment when He gave you the first one. You see, loving God with all of our being and loving our neighbors as ourselves does not mean that our self-love is no longer met, but rather that it is both met and satisfied in our devotion to God. It's that peace that passes understanding, that joy that never ends, that God-shaped hole that's filled. You see, self-love is not denied, but satisfied. Self-love is not ignored, but completely addressed in our relationship to God. The first commandment is God saying, "Come to me, and I will give you fullness of joy. I will satisfy your heart, soul, and mind with my glory." This is the first and great commandment. So what did Jesus mean by as yourself? He means with all of your self-love. That deep longing to diminish or eliminate pain or to increase or perpetuate happiness. But He gives us the key to doing this with the first commandment. Loving God with all of our being will satisfy our self-love. That's the key. You see, loving others as ourselves is possible because our self-love has already been addressed and satisfied in our love for God. We're not threatened when we seek to love others as ourselves because our self-love has already been satisfied. And we are delighted to obey Christ's command to love others as ourselves because we want to share with them the joy and contentment we have found in loving Him with all of our being. Our own self-love has been addressed and completed in Jesus Christ. We are simply sharing what we have already found. May God empower you to embrace this fundamental truth and empower you to seek Him with all of your being so that then you can love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.